Hello everyone, welcome to another Spotlight session. In today's session we're going to be looking at some of the books from our older collections which have interesting things to say about the weather. So the weather is our topic for this special collection Spotlight session, and I've got 4 books out which I will show you over the course of the video. The first one that I want to show you is this book here. So this is quite a hefty tome, as you can see, and the title of this is in Latin, so I'm going to pronounce it terribly, but the title is Miscellanea Antiqua Anglicana, or A Select Collection of Curious Tracts, illustrative of the history, literature, manners and biography of the English nation. Now, this says it's volume 1, but I haven't been able to find anywhere a reference to a volume 2, so this might just be a one-off thing that was gathered together. But what it appears to be is older documents that have been gathered together and reprinted in this volume here. So it was printed in 1816, printed for Robert Triphook of Old Bond Street in London. It's been edited. There are comments at the beginning of each of the different documents from the editor, but what I haven't been able to find out is who the editor was. So I'm not sure who wrote the comments. The comments come under the title advertisement, which is quite interesting, but they seem to be comments from the editor explaining where the documents came from and why they've been included. So the one that's of particular interest to us today is this one here. A document from 1614 entitled The Cold Year, a deep snow in which men and cattle have perished, to the general loss of farmers, graziers, husbandmen and all sorts of people in the country, and no less hurtful to citizens. So that's citizens obviously as people who live in cities as opposed to the countrymen. Written dialogue-wise in a plain familiar talk between a London shopkeeper and a North Country man, in which the reader may find many things for his profit. So this is talking about the winter of 1614 to 1615, apparently originally published in 1615 and talking about a particularly harsh winter. So the document itself is it's quite nicely designed, and it's as it says, it's written as a dialogue between two people talking about the hardships that they've experienced because of this great winter cold in this particular year. But what's also of particular interest is the information that the editor has provided in the so-called advertisement at the beginning of the document. So he says that when he was putting things together, he didn't intend to include any documents that were of a particularly local interest or related to one specific time, but this one he felt was worthy of being included because at this most extraordinary season, it may be not unacceptable to the reader to include this document, which suggests that this was being published at a time when the weather was extraordinary. And if we think back to the date when this was published, this was put together in 1816, that was the year that was referred to as the year without summer. So in 1815, Mount Tambora in Indonesia had erupted, and the dust clouds that had been expelled from the volcano had effectively covered the earth, and the following year and for some years afterwards the weather was very much out of sorts. It was very dark, it was very wet, there were famines and livestock died. Also, of course, this particular dark season was what prompted the session at Lake Geneva when Byron and Shelley were writing ghost stories, which was apparently the formation of the idea for Mary Shelley to write the book Frankenstein. So that was that particular year, and that is why the editor of this particular volume felt that he wanted to include this description of a particularly harsh winter in 1614. Right, the second book that I've got out that I would like to show you from our older books collection related to weather is a much smaller book than the first one, and it has a rather pretty cover, as you can see with the embossing around the edge and the gilding on the name and title. But this is Weather Forecasting by Simple Methods by F.S. Granger. So this is a book published 1909, published in Nottingham by a Nottingham author. So F.S. Granger is Francis Smith Granger, who was born in Nottingham in 1833. And he was recorded in the census records as a jeweller and watchmaker. We also know that he was a Freemason, and that he had an obituary in the Royal Meteorological Society, I always get stumble over that word, in their quarterly journal after he died at the end of 1912. So as well as being professionally a jeweller and a watchmaker, he was by hobby interested in the weather, interested in looking at the weather, recording the weather, and he published various articles and so on about that. Now, his book here, Weather Forecasting by Simple Methods, was reviewed in Nature in 1910. So the book was published in 1909. It was reviewed in the journal Nature. And the review was a little bit scathing, I have to say. Having had a look at the review, it notes that all the examples that Granger gives in this book are from his own observations in Nottingham, which, while giving examples from his own observations is great, it does say, the work may prove useful to local observers, but it is doubtful to what extent some of the conclusions arrived at can be considered general. And it also notes that his cloud classification is incomplete and is not that approved by international agreement. So it seems as though this particular book was looked at as something a little bit parochial, something that was published by somebody who'd been observing his local region, published using those explanations, but that they weren't really of much use for a wider use. But the book itself is quite nice, it's quite fun to read, and as the review indicates, a lot of it is to do with how you use observation of cloud forms and colours and height in predicting what the weather is going to do over the course of the succeeding day, or even a day or two afterwards. So it's got descriptions of the different types of clouds, and then it's got a variety of little chapters that talk about what the different cloud types are and what they mean when they are seen in conjunction with different wind directions and so on. So it's quite a nice little book to read, and it is potentially, I suppose, quite useful for us here in Nottingham, although maybe not more generally, as the review states. Granger's son was a Bromley House Library member, and he also donated, we know of at least one book that he donated to our collection because it was specifically recorded in the minutes. And also in the minutes, there's a note that in 1891, Mr. Granger was paid 8 shillings and sixpence for clock cleaning. And since Francis Granger, who wrote this book, is recorded in the census records as being a jeweller and watchmaker, I wonder whether that Mr. Granger was actually him, or at least maybe a member of his family. So local connections to Bromley House as well, but maybe something a little bit less of wider use. Third book which I want to show you from the special collections in this session about weather is something a little bit different. This is something rather unusual and not like any of the other books that we're going to be looking at today. So this book, as you can see from the cover, is Daily Weather Telegrams, Forms and Codes for Use in Egypt, published in 1938 in Cairo as part of the government press there. Ministry of Public Works for Egypt, and it's in English at one end of the book and in Arabic at the other end of the book. So we have the same information, I assume. I don't read Arabic, so I'm not certain, but we have the Arabic cover and Arabic text from the back end, well, from our point of view, from the back end of the book, and the English cover and English text from the other end of the book. So this book was, as I say, it was published in 1939, but it was written at the very end of 1938, and it's to do with weather forecasting in Egypt. Egypt in 1938 was in a slightly unusual position as far as, countries and governance went. So just to give a very quick summary based on my quite loose research on what was happening in Egypt in the 1930s. Egypt had been a protectorate of Britain for some time, and for some period that protectorateship was unofficial, although the British did occupy Egypt during that early period. Egypt was still technically a part of the Ottoman Empire up until Up until the up until the First World War. Okay, so Egypt was part of the Ottoman Empire until the First World War, but the English had invaded at the end of the 19th century and had declared a kind of, as I say, unofficial protectorate. In the First World War, when the Ottoman Empire entered the war in support of the Central Powers, the British declared an actual official protectorate in Egypt and made the Sultan declare Egypt independent of the Ottoman Empire. Now, this protectorate officially ended in 1922 when Sultan Fuad I declared himself King of Egypt, but the British occupation continued. So the British were still in Egypt. This was mostly due to the British claim on the Suez Canal and their requirements for keeping control of that as access to India. And this slightly weird situation in Egypt was made more official by the Anglo-Egyptian Treaty in 1936, which stated that the British had the right to station troops in Egypt for defence of the Suez Canal, and they also continued to control the training of the Egyptian army. So in 1938, when this was published, Egypt was in the rather unusual situation of being not part of the British Empire, in fact never ever having been part of the British Empire, but hugely under British influence, particularly in terms of government and military matters. So this book is not specifically military. It is a civilian governmental book to provide standard information for people recording the weather at the various different weather stations around Egypt to then be able to send back to the central authority. Now, in the front of the book, you'll see that it's part of the Alan Sillitoe collection, which I shall talk about a little bit more in a moment. But there's also a little note in pencil at the top of the front page, which says, remitted from Mr. L.J. Sutton, Cairo, 9th of January 43. So remitted in this case, I would guess means presented or taken from, given as a gift from. And L.J. Sutton, we find out a few pages later, in 1939, was the director of the Meteorological Service of the Physical Department of the Egyptian government. So he wrote the foreword to this book and therefore, and a few years later, was responsible for it being remitted somewhere else. Now, where it was remitted to, we don't really have any information, but there's a possible suggestion if we look at Alan Sillitoe's life, which I will do in a moment. So the book itself is full of codes. It's full of little bits of information which tell you how to put together a string of code that explains the weather conditions that you've observed on a particular date in a particular place. So the forms of the clouds at different heights, the force of the wind, the total amount of cloud, and where you are, where you're giving your report from. And then it goes into more detail to give you which codes relate to which different things. So no low cloud, it would be a 0 in that particular place in the code. Cumulus of fair weather, a number 1. And it has also interesting things like the description of the force of the wind on the Beaufort scale from calm, where smoke rises vertically, up to a hurricane, Beaufort force 12. Very rarely occurs except at sea, so unlikely to happen in Egypt on land, I guess. So the book is quite fascinating, a little bit mysterious. It's full of all these little codes talking about these sorts of interesting things, these changes in the weather that you would put together to create a picture via a series of letters and numbers which describes what was going on at that particular time. And also included in the book as an insert is a page completely filled in with exactly these sorts of weather observations. There's some Arabic writing at the bottom as well. The date has been chopped off. It's clearly November, I think maybe 1934. Not sure what the actual date is, but this is obviously an example of a chart that people would fill in to record weather data, and this was found slipped into the front of the book. So as I say, the book is part of the Alan Sillitoe collection, which, if you've seen Sally's excellent spotlight session that we put up in February this year, you will know was a collection of items which were personally owned by Alan Sillitoe and his wife Ruth Fainlight, and were donated to the library by Ruth after Alan died. Now, Alan's early life involved a variety of different interests which have some bearing on this particular volume. So he was very interested in maps, he was interested in depictions of other places, he had a lifelong interest in travel and travel writing, and an interest, particularly as a young man, in exotic places, places that were very different from his upbringing in Nottinghamshire. So he had a passion for maps, exotic locations, travel brochures. He also very much wanted to be part of the military. So he was growing up during the Second World War. He joined the Air Training Corps, intending to sign up, but the war ended before he was old enough to actually join up. But he went on to be trained in navigation, radio communications within the RAF. And he went on to serve for 2 years in Malaya as a radio operator. So this book speaks to an awful lot of the interests that Alan Sillitoe had, and we know that the Alan Sillitoe collection contains quite a number of military records and handbooks and manuals and things for this sort of thing. So I would suspect that he acquired this at some point during his military career, and it became part of the collection that he had in his summer house, and that was then subsequently donated to the library. That I want to introduce to you during this session has a slight link to the previous one, the previous book being a book of codes for recording the weather in Egypt. There is a very slight link because the author of this book did spend some time in Egypt. A bit tenuous, but there we go. So this book is back to being a kind of descriptive work looking at things including the weather. This is a country calendar published in 1928 by Reverend Tickner Edwards, and we have a picture of Tickner Edwards just here. This is from the National Portrait Gallery website and is available to use on a Commercial Commons license, so we're okay to be showing that on our little video. And this is a book which we acquired new in September 1928, and it's not in great condition anymore, unfortunately. The binding has become quite loose and the spine is loose, but it's a rather lovely little book with this green book cloth and then the silhouette image on the front, very 1920s. I'm not quite sure what's happened to it here. It looks as though it's faded around the edge, so maybe a pamphlet or something was stored on top of it that's then bled the red ink onto the cover. But either way, it's definitely still readable, if not in its tip-top condition. So this is actually, as it turns out, an absolutely lovely book. I picked it up just because it talks about the weather, and I thought it might be interesting to look at for this session. And as soon as I started reading it, I was absolutely charmed by it. The first section talks about going out very early in the morning on a winter's day when there's been a heavy frost but sunshine is forecast for the rest of the day, and walking by a river where there are reeds and rushes, and there's been ice that has formed within the reeds and rushes, and then as the sunshine hits the ice, it starts to break up and falls down into the river below in little chunks of various sizes, causing notes as if bells are ringing. And the description is absolutely fantastic. It's really atmospheric and just a really nice thing to read. So I'm very glad to have discovered this book as part of the research for this spotlight session. It seems a shame that so few people have read it over the years. We've got the issue slip in the front here, and it seems to have only been borrowed about a dozen times since 1928. So I would recommend that people should read this book. It's very good. So it goes through the year, talks about each month, and within each month there's as there often is in older books like this, there's a little description of what's going to be mentioned in the chapter, and many of these descriptions are about the weather. It's about the weather and it's about nature. It's about the animals and birds and insects that could be seen in the surrounding countryside of Sussex, which is where Edwards where he had his vicarage, and it looks at the way that these things change over the course of the year. Of course, reading it now, it's quite interesting because you can definitely see some interesting changes in what we know today as the weather, and things that may be related to climate change, different animals and birds that are more common in 1928 than they are nowadays, or that are arriving from migration at slightly different times from as they do nowadays. So from that point of view, it's quite interesting. But it's also, as I say, just a really nice book to read. So Tickner Edwards was quite an interesting chap. Edward Tickner Edwards, in fact, excellent name. He's particularly renowned for his writings on nature, but particularly about bees and beekeeping. So he was sometimes known, according to various articles that I found online, as the beekeeper of Burpham, because he lived in Burpham in Sussex. He had published a few things. I should start with his dates. He was born in 1865. And he had published a few books, mainly about bees and apiary, before the war. And then in the First World War, he joined up with the Royal Army Medical Corps, and he served in Egypt in that capacity, hence the link to the book that I just showed you. When he came out of the army, he decided to train for the clergy, and he got a post back at Burpham, where he had been living before the war anyway, and continued to publish books as well. So he published books, non-fiction books, but he also published a few novels. In 1914, he published a novel known as, which was called Tansy, in which apparently a beautiful village girl upsets farming traditions by training to become a shepherdess. And this was filmed as quite an early film in the 1920s, and was apparently quite successful. So this is a picture of him taken in later life, he stayed in Burpham after he retired from the clergy, retired in 1935, and he passed away in 1944. Now, we only have 3 of his books in our collection. One of them is this one, which I'm talking about now, which talks about nature and the weather and things in general. The other 2 books of his that we have are his 2 key works about beekeeping. So if you want to know about beekeeping, apiary, this is the man to go to, and we have those 2 books in the collection as well.